Today we want to look at Chapter 14. Chapter 14 deals with the family and lots of issues there to consider from a sociology point of view. And we'll go ahead and get started. Here on this first slide we see a lot of topics that we're going to cover. So a lot of terms related to the families and bring in the three big perspectives and divorce and some lifestyles there, and then social policy at the end. So really about the same format as our other chapters that we've had. This next slide gives us our thoughts to consider. So what do families look like in different parts of the world? You know, it's not just the same as what we think of, and just as we can have different cultures, you know, that also extends to the idea of family. So how do people select mates? What type of criteria do they use, if any? And how does that differ? What about when a marriage fails with divorce? You know, what happens there? How does that affect all the family members? And then what are some different types of the family as opposed, for example, the nuclear family and the different variations we might find. Our next slide here does give us our two definitions for family. So the nuclear family is first. So that's mom, dad, and children. And then the extended family would be mom, dad, children, and others. So the family is the building block of society. You know, we can't go anywhere without finding the family. Now the form may be different, but that just shows us once again there's never going to be a time where there are people on earth and we don't have something called the family. Alright, family makeup, a couple again of concepts everybody's really familiar with, I'm sure, but monogamy, mono being one, and gamy, the last part of the word, reflecting union, so one union, and traditionally that definition in the United States has been one man and one woman at a time. Serial monogamy is when one of the partners dies or divorce or something occurs where that union is separated, and then one can be remarried again, but not in plural. So we don't have any type of polygamy that would be legal in the United States. Alright, so that's a good introduction to this next slide, but polygamy is many, poly, many, again, something everybody knows, and same thing for gamy being union. So one who has multiple spouses. So whether it's a husband with many wives or a wife with many husbands, it's probably much more common to find a man with multiple wives than a woman with multiple husbands, but you do throughout history find both. Alright, so polygamy is of a marriage of more than one woman to multiple, one husband to multiple wives rather. And then polyandry is one woman with multiple male partners. Alright, so here in the United States, what's been common over the last 70 years, and you can see we've got some charts that are roughly about every 30 to 40 years, again beginning in 1940. So married couples is by far in 1940 the most popular option, and it still is today in 2010, but it has really come down. So it shows us that the family has been changing quite a bit over time. So one slice of the chart that's really grown is female-headed households, from 4% in 1940 to 13% in 2010. And then non-family households would be people who are traditionally not related by marriage, birth, blood, or something of that. So people who live together who feel relationships towards one another but typically don't fit that U.S. Census definition of a family. Alright, so kinship, that would, for example, be one of those terms that talks about the affinity that groups might have one to another that maybe sometimes doesn't automatically jump out to us. That's the traditional dominant style. Alright, but we can trace our relationship to others. Your family tree might be another way to really talk about what here is on slide 8. So if you do it through both parents, that is your bilateral, and then through the father is patrilineal, and through the mother is matrilineal. So if you maybe could do some research into your own family tree, and you could trace it back quite a bit. Alright, who rules in families? And traditionally Again, history has favored patriarchy, so fathers, males, are really perceived as the head. There, again, are some societies in which mothers do that, or women, the matriarchy, and then there are those where it's evenly split, and that's the egalitarian, which, historically speaking, is probably the least common of the types that we see here on our screen. All right, so here's an example of all the things we've been talking about. And this is from the aspect of polyandry, one wife and many husbands. So, why would you see that in this type of culture? Well, it has to do with the type of culture that exists there, and primarily it's, an agricultural community where a lot of hard muscle and labor is needed, and so that would give us at least some incentive to find those type of unions there. All right, so here's our big three theories. The structural functionalist is first, and what functions does the family serve for society? And you can see those listed here. One is reproduction, two, protection, three, socialization, preparing us for later roles in life. Family regulates who we can have these intimate relations with in terms of reproduction. Affection and companionship, so that's, number 4 relates to the physical part, number 5 the emotional and psychological part, and then it helps to also define social status, relation among different people. All right, the social conflict view is next, and for example, we can explain families in terms of how it creates inequality. So your mom and dad may have considerable wealth and assets built up, and then when they die, they can leave that to their children. Doesn't go up for grabs, but generally it's passed on down through familial lines. With the same idea here, patriarchy comes into play, and a lot of times men have more say-so over these resources than women do. All right, so here under social conflict, it would say, well, there's certain aspects of the family that operate as negatives to society, and so maybe some of those should be revisited. The symbolic interaction viewpoint looks at, as our picture might suggest, the relationship between these individuals and the intimacy that results. And intimacy sometimes can really be defined as shared fear. So that's certainly one thing that families do. They share their good times together and their bad times, and their hopes, joys, and fears with these people that help us cope and get through our challenges in the world. All right, so and again, now family, through this viewpoint, would be our traditional definition, and maybe some of our non-traditional definitions of family, of people who really have no connection to each other, but they just feel that really close bond. And later in the chapter, we'll see that again come up again one more time. All right, now here is the feminist view, and that's really a kind of a sub-theory under the conflict, because our two sides that are opposing or can see as opposing would be based on gender here, so males and females. And one side wants to have an equal shot, and the other side kind of wants to keep their power. All right, now as this applies to the family, the feminist view would say there's lots of aspects of family life that operate to the disadvantage of women. They would say we need to study these things, and we somehow need to come up with a solution to where inequality would not be perpetuated through something as pervasive and necessary as the family. All right, our next slide is a summary of all those perspectives that we've looked at. That's another routine thing our chapter does, but just kind of make sure you understand what each perspective is generally kind of talking about, or its emphasis as it's given to us here. All right, in terms of finding a mate, endogamy is finding someone who's close to you in terms of your characteristics, so your age, your social class, maybe your race, your ethnicity, things of that nature, your interest, your intelligence. In the United States, it's pretty much wide open, or compared to a lot of places it is. Exogamy is, for example, outside your group, so maybe a different race and someone of a different age, different social class, different income level, and things of that. It seems to be that endogamy was the most common outcome, but in recent years, more people have chosen mates that were exogamous to them. Been a lot of hardship for some people over the years to do that, but that seems to be dissipating a little bit somewhat. All right, some other factors to consider in selecting a partner is the incest taboo. So some people are off limits, and those are your family members or certain aspects of your family members. So you might think of Jerry Lee Lewis, who was a entertainer some years ago, and he actually married a young lady who was 13, so she was really young compared to him at the time. And then she was also a cousin of his, so that was a double whammy in that selection. All right, homogeny is next here on our slide, and typically people tend to gravitate toward those who are like them, not only for their mates but their friends. So people look for these desired characteristics that are very similar to what they themselves possess, is the idea. Now, this next slide mentions the love relationship, and it is the idea here that parents do want to help their children succeed, and so they do try to help them base these relationships on love and affection, and that's true, I think, in the United States. But what about places where love and affection is not seen as serious for your children when they make these decisions? So there's lots of places that arranged marriages is what I'm thinking of right now, to where parents will choose the partner for their children when they're very young. We can't leave this serious decision to young people, and they'll make alliances with others there, and maybe some completely different criteria are used than simply if you're in love or not, and those feelings of love for another. All right, so that's what the bottom of our slide is actually saying is, what about these other factors that could be used for making these decisions? All right, so first age, or age at first marriage, rather, here in 8 countries, and you can see for both women and men, and the United States is about middle in there, so 26 for women, about 28.5 for men. First marriage. All right, now some of the variations in family life, we can certainly look at social class differences. And, they have, again, different criteria that they emphasize because of where they lie along the social spectrum. So upper class, they want to really maintain what they have. Their lineage is very important. Lower class, for example, we find a different scenario. Generally, maybe not a two-parent family, but one-parent family seems to be something that's much more likely to occur. And, of course, parents who are of upper class tend to encourage their children to be more free-thinking, outside the box. That's typically what they're going to experience as adults. And then parents of lower social class tend to emphasize to their children, hey, follow the rules, conform, don't rock the boat, because that's what they have experienced. And parents generally want their children to succeed, so they're passing on to them the wisdom of the world if they know it. All right, so we're looking at family in terms of racial and ethnic differences, and so we have some different groups listed here, much like our last chapter there, but much shorter in scope. But it shows us for African American mothers, the kin networks are very important. We have a larger number of single mother families there than any of the other groups listed, so that is an important means of social support when you have children. Native American families, they, for example, also are going to have hardships, but they're cushioned through the lines of social support that they have developed. And then under our last category here, we have Mexican Americans, and they mentioned there a couple things about first, the pride in family, the extended family. Some of our graphs from Chapter 10 showed that the Mexican Hispanic American population is just really going to increase dramatically here in the next 100 years in the United States. And then machismo, which is often mentioned and in somewhat of negative terms, but really is a positive characteristic overall for Mexican American families. All right, so question time. Do you know somebody who's still living at home with mom and dad, and maybe they're in their late 20s or early 30s? Okay, so this is something that our book mentions as in a frame of life there from Italian point of view, and so you can also look a little bit more in the book if you want to continue to read that. Now, the interesting question is why would people remain or choose to remain at home? And there's lots of reasons, of course, maybe one could think of, and probably economics is one there. But typically, after school and 20s, people are out trying to start their own family. So that is kind of, I think, where our book's coming from, is that, why would somebody be maybe at home and maybe not as active in searching out to start their own family. All right, so this slide just shows us single parent families for all the categories. 4 categories listed here of people have increased, and the numbers do seem to be at least doubling in most cases there, except for Asians there, the bottom right hand 2 pie charts. All right, so if we do have maybe a rising in single parenthood, that would also indicate that grandparents would be an important resource for those parents, because parenthood is an awesome responsibility there that does take a lot of help, even if you have both parents there at home. All right, now socialization is a critical skill that must go on, and that's really for the benefit of the family itself in a micro sense, and then in a macro sense for society at large. All right, and so that socialization can be helped with others, the support system there, grandparents being the one I had in mind. All right, so maybe one bottom thing to consider here is there's very little consensus or agreement on how to produce happy, well-adjusted offspring, and there's no shortage of opinions there because you can find all types of experts. I know in the past, Dr. Spock in the 60s was, very influential, and who was to say that was really good advice. All right, now here, just another indication there of a change in how people are creating their own households, or the delay in creating their old households. So boomerang generation, or the full nest syndrome as compared to the empty nest. Empty nest is when they leave home and how parents have trouble coping. Full nest is when baby bird refuses to move. Boomerang is they're returning home. So different names for the same phenomenon. And that seems to be something really popping up in the U.S. and maybe definitely in the last 10 years or so we can understand maybe a little bit better because of low-paying jobs and economic recessions and things of that nature that would affect people and their outlook on making really big commitments for the future. All right, under childbearing patterns, our next slide here, we see with adoption. And we know that process there, so it's defined for us. And then dual income families, 2-earner families there, just shows that in the past, you could have a single earner family, and that was enough to support an entire family, so mom, dad, and children. Today, that's not the case. So here between our young people 25 and 34, just about all of men are in the labor force, and more than 2/3 of women are in the labor force. Now, for women, that's really a double shift, a second shift, because they have the responsibility really as a primary caregiver and keeping up with at home, and now also it extends out into the work world, so getting hit twice. Now for men, they typically don't have the pressure that women do is keeping up with the home and the children. I'm sure many men do, but they don't have that official distinction there that women do of having to work both in and outside the home. All right, so more about single parent families here, and so it's hard enough with 2 as our last slide indicated. So what about with 1? So There's a lot of single-headed families in the United States, so our chart here gives us an estimate of about nearly 25% of white families with children under 18, and then the percentages increase from there for Hispanic and African Americans. Single fathers, not just single mothers, but single fathers as well. Single mothers are probably hit harder because of the disparity in income from men and women. But you can see that really in the last 25 years, single-headed families by fathers have increased 25%. All right, so step families are next, and so this is more of our extended family. The divorce rate here is stated at 45%, so that seems to be maybe a little less than you might think. Maybe the fact that they're incorporating those who remarry is what brings it down just a little bit. All right, so it is important there, if that occurs, that children minimize any negative impacts that might put them at risk depending on their age and, of course, with their gender. And so now there's a comment made here on the end of the slide that that those being in step families, there's no evidence to suggest they'll be any better off than those who are in a single parent family. So that's kind of a disturbing comment there to think about. Now, trends in divorce in our next slide here, and we'll have a graphical representation in just a few slides, I believe it was. But the divorce rate has leveled off here, so it's peaked in the 60s and then leveled off, and then even since the 1980s, it's seen a decrease. All right, so nearly 2/3 of the people who divorced eventually get married again. Now, divorce is something that's been more popular than in the early history of the United States, and here's some reasons why. Greater social acceptance of divorce. There's not the stigma and labels attached with it anymore. There are more liberal divorce laws, and in the past there were very few reasons that one could get divorced, and really it was only available to the upper class, and so you just kind of had to deal with it without getting divorced. Fewer children, greater income. Now, greater income may be surprising, but once you can make it on your own, if you really don't like somebody, you can get rid of them. And so I think that's where that comes into. And so that's not hard to understand that, more opportunities for women may actually lead to greater family income. All right, so one study here on our next slide tracked over 6,000 children before and after divorce and found that their behavior did not suffer. So that is a pretty good sample size. Other studies have shown other things, and some of those is if it's an unhappy household, then generally children, they blame themselves or they suffer, and all types of negative effects that not just while at home but extend on into later life. All right, so maybe the solution there is to end the harmony, but not the family unit. So that's maybe a comment there at the bottom that just assuming that children are better off following a breakup is maybe not as guaranteed as has been thought in the past. Here's the graph I was thinking of earlier there, but shows what our couple other charts and words our slides ago showed us there, and just a graphical representation of the divorce rate in the United States over about a 90-year period. All right, so we're down there to the right-hand side, but you can see that the gap between marriage and divorce was wider earlier, and then as we get closer to our time today, it's narrowing. All right, so we're looking at different lifestyles. So marriage, maybe some of its prestige has been lost as a way of life. So typically, when are you adult? And one of the answers to that question is, when you had children, which, traditionally has been connected with marriage. And then the second one there is when you're, paying for your own way. You're financially independent. Those are two things really connected to when you actually become an adult. All right, so now just mentioned it on the last slide, but the marriage rate there near the end of the graph, it seemed to be slowing down, and so this seems to be a trend that's been in effect for about 50 years. All right, so two things maybe that may affect the marriage rate declining is postponing until later in life. We saw the age at first marriage for women 26 and men 28 or 28 and a half. And then what about maybe just not getting married and having a partnership without marriage? So maybe cohabitation or something along those lines. All right, so the next slide here, 34, does mention cohabitation. And generally what happens is cohabitation is just not that long. So they either dissolve or they either get married. So I think some of the usual time frames is 2 to 3 years, and then a decision is made. Some people decide to remain single, not even cohabitation, but they maybe for career or just their preference, whatever it might be. All right, and our next slide talks about marriages without children. And that seems to be more of an option now. And again, you can have as many different reasons for people not having children than ever before. But it seems, some people, just think automatically that becoming pregnant is easy, and maybe that accounts for some of the people who don't have children there, as they just never thought it would be a problem, and it actually is. Another type of lifestyle that's mentioned here on this slide is the lesbian and gay relationships, and so also that the end of the slide mentions the discrimination that they face on not only personal but legal levels, and that's the legal level discrimination is discussed a little bit more in these next last few slides. All right, question to think about is, how about divorce and serving in the military? Does the stress of the separation or what's going on, how much of an impact does that have, and how many military families have actually experienced that? So that's a really good question to consider. All right, here in this next slide shows us unmarried couple households by state, and so the kind of purplish, lavenderish color there is our highest grade, and then the kind of palish yellow is the lowest grade. So we, North Carolina, have a little bit of a lime green there, kind of in the middle. All right, the last few slides look at gay marriage there. So it is interesting sides to look at. And whether for or against, there's some arguments that can be made. So whatever people think about that, you'll just have to decide. Maybe this gives us some additional things to think about. All right. Now the younger generation there, of course, they really been bombarded with lots of ideas on that you should have freedom there, as compared to maybe the older generation, which is not. And it was more of a maintain the traditional ideas of marriage instead of same sex. All right, so that may be our bottom slide there. That the bottom point on this slide addresses that. Same sex marriage, does that attack traditional marriage? It probably depends on who you ask and their answer. So within the United States, we have Vermont and Massachusetts, which has decided there in those states that same-sex couples do have the right to marry and some of the legal benefits as well. There's lots of other nations that have done the same thing. It seems maybe more slowly here in the United States than some of the other nations, as I remember. A lot of European nations, for example, have maybe given these rights, or some of them have, since the late 1980s. All right, our three big perspectives as it applies to gay marriage there. So the functionalist, we would want to consider reproduction and how that plays into who can be married. Religious viewpoints also would something to be considered. Conflict theorists would say, hey, if you don't let everybody marry, then you're going to create a hierarchy of citizens. So that's the very in keeping with Marx and his theory. Some people would be considered second-class citizens. All right, they would also say, well, hey, we did it for civil rights and race and ethnicity, so, this is really just a different side to the same issue. The interactionist, that theory of sociology would look either at the sides drawn up when it comes to support or opposition there of other different groups on this topic. I'd also look at discrimination and prejudice that we've seen in the other chapters, but along these lines of who is the proper partner to love. All right, so maybe these will help us in terms of either making new policy, changing existing policy, depending on what happens. In North Carolina last May, they did vote on what the state's definition of marriage meant, and so it was 60 to 40% in favor of a traditional one man, one woman. So, one of the political people there said, well, it's just a matter of time before it changes to where, there would be recognition of same-sex relationships. He said it may not be our lifetime. He said it may not be the next generation, but he said certainly the one after that he thought would be enough time to do it. So who knows if he's right or wrong, but he probably had a good pulse on things in making that comment. All right, so domestic partnership is mentioned there, but that would incorporate and give approval to these type of relationships. They would get all the benefits that heterosexual couples do. And for example, maybe end of life type decisions there would be included in those. All right, and this last chart just shows us where in the United States where we stand on this issue, and of course it's color coded there. The blue, purple, lavender there does allow it, and then we go down to others that prohibit, and that's where North Carolina and much of the South is. Okay, this has been a little bit shorter than the other recordings, but hopefully this has helped, and I will be speaking again to you soon, and thank you for your time.